Good morning. I'm Matt Driskill, editor of Asian Aviation Magazine and AsianAviation.com. Welcome to the latest In Conversation, sponsored by Metrojet of Hong Kong. Today we are in conversation again with Stefano Baronci, the Director General of ACI Asia-Pacific. Stefano, welcome back to In Conversation. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you for having me again.
Good to have you back. We actually, about 6 months ago, we spoke in December. I think you were my last guest on In Conversation last year. We were welcoming the news that vaccines were coming out. People were just starting to get shots in the arm and things like that. And we all, at that time, the prognosticators were hoping that, well, okay, give it 6 months, everything will be back to normal. It really hasn't worked out that way. There's been vaccinations are moving ahead. I'm vaccinated. I don't know if you are or not, but
Yeah.
you are. So it is moving ahead. Give us kind of a quick look at the past 6 months of the year. How are airports doing in Asia and the rest of the world?
Well, I think that the last 6 months have been quite complex for the region, for Asia Pacific. I would like to start actually, Matt, from the end, meaning from where we are now, with some positive signs, because I think if we look at the last few days, there have been an important G7 meeting, and the G7 communique acknowledged that states recognize the importance of international standards to reopen and to go towards the recovery of the air transport sector. And they also recognize the fact that some international standards, including the health identification systems, should be introduced with the mutual recognitions between states, with mutual recognitions of vaccine and testing protocols. I think this is a very important sign. And just today, Japanese people can travel to Italy without having to be quarantined. So we can start to see some changes. Also, this week is important because on Wednesday, Dubai will reopen Terminal 1. It is a signal of the ambition of this airport to be again the transfer passenger platform that is crucial, strategic at worldwide level. And finally, in Europe on the 1st of July, the COVID certificate the digital COVID certificate will be introduced. So in the EU market, people will be able to move from one country to another without having to be tested or quarantined using these digital platforms that prove that you have been vaccinated, you have been tested, or you have recovered from the disease. Finally, people know very well that China has reached the 1 billion people that have been vaccinated, and you rightly remember the fact that vaccination is moving forward. But if we look at the numbers, about 748 million people received 2 shots. So potentially those are the people that would be eligible to travel with quarantine being relaxed or to some extent avoided. But this in theoretical terms. If we narrow down to Asia, only 7.5% of the population has been vaccinated. And this is where the problem stands. And this is where I think we can better understand. This is why we can better understand why Asia, over the last months, have been slower in changing their policy. So since December up to now, unfortunately, there have been not very much change, because we still have quarantine, we still have travel restrictions. On average, depending on the time, that traffic has recovered by 20-30% versus the 2019 levels. Of course, there are exceptions, and the main exception is still the fact that some countries which have been able to control the epidemiological curve can enjoy the domestic and depend on the domestic traffic. So, for example, China is now recovered by 90%, South Korea by 60%, but countries such as India, which should also be able to rely on domestic traffic, are still having problem to control the disease. So if you remember, Matt, at that time we were saying the region, it was the first one to know about this crisis, will be the first one to recover. Actually, this is probably was probably a too optimistic view. The situation is much more mixed than we could think in 2020.
Let me jump in there. I mean, you covered a broad swath of information there, and I want to pick up on that. You talked about domestic markets. China is almost back domestically to pre-COVID levels, almost. I think it's 89%, something like that. And you mentioned South Korea. You talked about India. I would have thought on vaccination levels, and this is very unscientific, it's just anecdotal, because I've lived in Asia full-time since 1997. I would have thought Asia would have done better with vaccinations. Taiwan, for example, was very good at controlling the spread of the virus, but then it got caught short. You had some breakouts there. Their vaccination level wasn't anything near what I actually thought it was when I started reading the reports. Japan is having trouble getting people to take the shot. Why are Asian countries sort of, I guess, lack of a better term, lagging behind?
Well, there are two reasons, in my opinion. The first one is that certainly this is the region that is very highly populated. So when you take the 16% of Chinese people that got 2 shots, we talk about 220 million people who have been vaccinated. If you compare this with the US, where about 149 million people have got 2 shots, that means 45% of the entire population. So certainly we have to take into account that countries such as China, India, Japan, Indonesia, Vietnam are highly populated. So the challenge per se is very, very high. But it is also true, and you are absolutely right, that many countries are lagging behind. And this, of course, depends on the supply, on the fact that the plans was not as expected, and some countries had a problem to get supply, but also because to some extent, interestingly, some of these countries have been very good in controlling the crisis in terms of numbers of cases, of positive cases, and people were not incentivized enough to get vaccinated whenever they could. So it's the case here in Hong Kong, where I think if I'm not wrong, the vaccine was available since April for the first categories, and since that time numbers have not been as expected in terms of vaccination rates. So I guess that I think that some countries are understanding the need and the importance to speed up the process, to optimize the vaccination rate, and this is why they are in this moment speeding up. It will take time, and of course they look at cases such as US, Europe, Middle East, where vaccination rates have certainly an impact in terms of reducing the number of deaths and serious cases, they also have to some extent an impact on contributing to reopen some corridors.
Okay. Stefano, let's talk about technology, and we're going to talk about standards as well in a minute, but I want to talk about technology. We've seen airports, not just airports, but airlines and everybody else, but you represent airports, so let's talk about airports. Touchless technology, the biometrics seem to be getting a big kick from all of this. Airports and the industry were actually moving in this direction, have been for quite a while. COVID seems to have sort of accelerated the process. I'm curious, though, because if you look at airports like Singapore, which shut down construction on Terminal 5, they've closed two other terminals, basically, that are not operating simply because they don't need them. There's not enough traffic. All of that affects the revenue that airports have to spend on these new technological investments. Is it happening? Are they saying, okay, we've got to move ahead with this, so we're going to spend the money? Or, do they have the money to spend on these investments?
Well, it is happening. It must happen, actually, and especially for the big platforms that are starting to receive international passengers and are already managing some important domestic traffic. So it is happening because we have to consider that there are new measures that are required by legislators. We have to consider that the complexity of checking the health of people will be added to the normal process. And we also have collected some experience that in Europe there is a tendency to duplicate the check at the airport in terms of health identification and passenger locator checks. So because of that, you need absolutely to rely on biometric, on contactless technology. And the case of Narita, which has piloted and tested the so-called Face Express, which is a model whereby at check-in, baggage drop, security, and boarding gates, you have your face recognized. Is an example. It will be launched in July. Now, as you rightly said, this will imply a cost. We saw that airports had to find ways to reduce their cost, but not up to the level of reaching or compensating, rather, the decrease in revenues. So the issue will be, certainly in the long term, how to make this business still sustainable. And I think, again, that in the short term, this meant by reducing cost, but also sometimes by getting the support of some states, such as in Japan, again sticking to this example, where some low interest rates have been applied for loans, where also there was the possibility to have the payment of the concession fees postponed at a later stage. By all means, airports have not received the same resources that airlines got, but I think that this is an issue that much certainly we will continue to discuss in our interview in a few months' time.
Okay. I'm actually going to combine, I've got sort of two questions on my list here that I can combine very easily. Standards. IATA's got the travel pass, IBM's come up with something, you've got 50 different companies that are coming up with 50 different, the Commons Pass, for example, from the Commons Project Foundation. Excuse me. All of these people are coming up with digital health passports or health certificates, testing digital passes, whatever you want to call them. But there's not any one set of standards out there, which I find very frustrating, simply because when I first started traveling overseas, I had to get vaccinations. I had my yellow card, the carte jaune, that showed my, yellow fever vaccine and hepatitis B vaccine or whatever it was. I mean, for someone that wants to travel internationally like you do and like I did back before 2020, I can't keep up with, have 5 different apps on my iPhone because this country only accepts the travel pass, and then this country only accepts the IBM pass. This one uses the Commons Project, the Commons Pass. When is an organization like ICAO or someone out there, I mean, it can't be that difficult to say, these are the standards that you will use in order to do a digital health pass or a certificate. Why are these standards not agreed on yet?
Yeah, and it's a very good question, and I can share your frustration. Whenever you go to a supermarket and you want to use your credit card, there is just one machine that can read different credit cards, and so we should get to the same level in the case of the health identification system. I think that the main reason is because we still experience a kind of a bottom-up process, whereby states have the final decision because the health is in play in respect to this. And this is why, again, I started this conversation with you by welcoming the move from the G7 countries, because we need leaders to install a process, a protocol, apply standards that others can follow, that others can learn from. So ICAO and the WHO have been working for a long time. They will continue to work. But at the end of the day, as you very well know, it's important that the states, especially the key aviation markets, can manage that level of complexity, and they can get to a true level of mutual recognition. And for the airports, this is particularly important because, of course, it's not up to us to decide what is the best tool to implement at an airport or a country level or international level. But certainly for us, what is important is to have a seamless process. If we have a multiplication of processes, at that time we will have queues, we will have chaos, and so that will mean also the difficulty of managing the so-called physical distancing. It will be difficult, especially at peak time. At the moment, if you think about it, we have much less flights, but all are concentrated in the same time. And this already is a matter of concern for us. If you duplicate the checks, the health checks, as I said, in Europe, 77% of the airports over the last month have duplicated those checks. So this, if you apply this for the regions like Asia, it will be certainly very, very difficult.
Well,
we hope that the states continue to work with the industry, and the airports have a role to play here, because if you think about it, we can work with airlines and states on trials. We can adapt the airport processes to accommodate and integrate these systems as required. And also, we can ensure that digital and non-digital evidences are accepted.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be, if you look at the figures, like I was reading a story this weekend about flying back in the U.S., it's chaos at the airports, and if you add in international flights, if and when they do really open, it's going to be chaos at the airport trying to get through the border control and everything. It's just standards really have got to get agreed on. Stefano, we're running a little tight on time here, so I want to take a quick break here. We're going to hear from our sponsor, Metrojet of Hong Kong. We'll be right back after this.
We're going to have the crown jewels of Asia, and I promise you we're going to have the nicest and busiest business aviation hangar in the region.
And we're back. We're in conversation with Stefano Baronci, the Director General of ACI Asia-Pacific. Stefano, let's switch gears for a moment. We actually, vaccines and the COVID-19 pandemic kind of goes along with this because we all need to be greener these days. Airports, I think, have done or are doing a much better job of going green than, say, airlines, for example. I think they're lagging a little bit. It's just my opinion. But I've seen, it's like every day, I read something new in the news about airports. Cambodia the other day had changed out some chillers that improved their green record. Is there one particular reason that's driving this investment in environmentalism?
Well, I think that, as you said, COVID has been an accelerator, for example, in terms of technology. It's the same thing for attention to become greener. Let's start by saying that the job for airports is easier than for airlines, because if you think about it, we just emit as airport operators only 2% of the total emissions generated by air transport. So because of that, but despite of this, I think that we have a social responsibility to make sure to do our part, to play our part. And I think that this question comes at the right time, Martin. Thank you for having me again, because we just announced, actually we reached 2 weeks ago a very important milestone in the journey to get to the net zero emissions target. It is a journey that actually started about 10 years ago when we launched in the region the so-called airport carbon accreditation, which is fundamentally a tool whereby you can measure your carbon footprint and depart from them and start from them for understanding what measures should be applied to improve. And by now, 60 airports participate to this program. Now, it's important to say that these 60 airports in the region manage 40% of the total traffic. And 6 of them have already reached carbon neutrality, which means that through offset, you control actually your CO2 emissions, and 2 of them are approximating to the net zero target. Now, when I referred about this important milestone, I mean that the airports in the regions, as much as the airports in the world, have committed to reach the target of net zero emission by 2050. And of course, we urged at the same time the states to work with us. Now, what this means in practical terms? It means that this goal is feasible, and we have proven it through a study that we have run over 1 year, ACI as ACI. And secondly, that there is a collective engagement by the airports to reach this objective. Now, the journey will be different depending on the region, depending on the country. So airports will have certainly different trajectories. And of course, you have to understand that there are measures that are controllable, such as the on-thermal decarbonization, like, for example, converting waste into energy, or the electrification of the electrical fleet. But there are measures that airports have to work with states, and they are not directly controlled by it, and such as the decarbonization of the energy grid. This is a very important aspect, and actually will be the key driver to reach the 2050 target, because it's the energy that we buy off-site which is the main generator of emissions. And this is why, again, the partnership with states will be crucial, because we cannot do this on our own. The airports that have reached a better level and reduced more the CO2 emissions are the ones that have easier access to renewable energy, such as Delhi, such as airports in Australia and in Japan. You referred about Cambodia, and I think Cambodia is a case where the airports belong to an international airport group, which has also airports in Japan, in Europe, in the US. The airport groups in this case is very, very useful because the experience collected can be exported and applied regardless of the region of origin.
You talked about some different countries. I mean, are there, let me just follow up on that briefly. Is it easier for a place like Cambodia, or you mentioned India with, it was more accessible, or I don't want to say easier, but it's more available to them, alternative sources of energy. I mean, are there, and again, we hear a lot about places like Cambodia, Australia, for example. Brisbane, I think, is doing a lot. Don't really hear that much about China doing things when it comes to airport decarbonization and things. Are there areas, countries that are doing better?
Well, as I said, countries like the ones that I mentioned, especially India and this, or for example, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, are certainly doing better, and the reason is because the journey is to some extent easier because already supported by technology, by local conditions, by regulatory framework, and again, accessibility to renewable energy, such as solar energy, is one of the reasons why these have done better. But I have to say, I mean, very frankly, that some of these airports, such as Delhi Airport, has also reached that level because of the management. And so just a few days, a few weeks ago, actually, we have recognized this important through the Asia-Pacific Carbon Airport Recognition, which is an award for the work done by Delhi in introducing the so-called taxi bot project. It's a project whereby aircraft in the taxiway are moved through a robotic hybrid vehicle that reduces dramatically, significantly, the CO2 emissions. So again, is a mix of willingness, vision, legal framework, and of course local conditions that have to be considered. You mentioned about China, and as you probably know, the leaders have announced that by 2060 the objective is to reach net zero emission, and this follows an announcement that came from the US, from the Europe first, and the US in 2050. Now, it's also important to mention that emissions trading scheme will be launched in China this summer, so in a little time. Now, for China, I think it's important to look at what the next plan will be over the next 5 years. It's important to consider that China is a great exporter of green technology. So it's possible to think that China will be able to catch up. Now, Europe reached the peak in terms of CO2 emissions in the 90s. The US reached that peak in 2006, 2007. China is forecasted to reach that peak by 2030. It means that we will have only 30 years to catch up. And of course, it is ambitious, but we have to consider that technology is very different from what it was in Europe in the 90s or at the beginning of the century. So again, we will be working with the Chinese airports, with the institutions, but also in the other countries. I think ACI Asia-Pacific has a role to play because this is also a matter to educate partners to focus on that, and we are here for that.
Stefano, I'd love to keep you on all day because I like seeing the planes go by in the background. It reminds me that people are still flying a little bit. But last question on the environment, and then we're going to have to end the show in a minute. A lot of people are talking about hydrogen. Airbus has come up with this big plan for hydrogen-powered airplanes by 2035, have a prototype flying by then. I personally have my doubts about hydrogen. I mean, it was actually the Russians flew a hydrogen-powered plane back in the 80s, I think. It's just, I mean, there's so much that has to go into changing the entire infrastructure that would affect airports, of course, because you're going to go from jet fuel storage to hydrogen storage, which is a whole different ballgame. And I had some very interesting figures from Pratt & Whitney engine expert saying that the amount of electricity that would be required to create the hydrogen necessary to fuel the number of planes that are currently flying, it would be, I don't have the figures in front of me, but it would be, thousands and thousands of gigawatts, which would completely destroy the idea of having a clean hydrogen fuel if you've got to burn all this fossil fuel to get the hydrogen. I know you don't want to slam Airbus or anything, and I don't either, but I just have my doubts that hydrogen is going to be workable in the next 20 or 30 years. I just can't see it. I mean, where does hydrogen fit in airport schemes?
Well, I think, that it will have to be seen if the plans will be met. It's true that the expectation is that in 10, 15 years we will have a first conversion of hydrogen aircraft that may take off. It's also true that some countries, again, Japan is a good example, is investing a lot into this transformation. And there are airports such as Kansai Airport that is as hydrogen stations at their airports in Japan. That being said, I'm with you in the sense that this cannot be the only solution. It will be SAF, it will be the electrification via battery, or in addition to hydrogen. To make possible, again, to reach the targets that the industry has set. As airports, you rightly said that there is a complexity that will have to be taken into account if this system is introduced, and there are different solutions that could be contemplated. We have just launched a publication that address this aspect and is available on the ACI website. Manufacturing hydrogen off-site or importing hydrogen in its gaseous form and liquefying it on-site, or rather bringing it already in its final form, are three options that could be considered. Of course, there is an investment to take into account. Ideally, having a pipeline that can transport the hydrogen to the gates is fantastic, would be fantastic, but it should be justified by an economy of scale to invest in the infrastructure. So at the moment, under these current circumstances, the transportation through trucks is the solutions that is more commonly contemplated. Again, I think that it's from an operational and economics perspective that the airports have to consider this and speak with the other partner to see what are the conditions and criteria, to work in that scenario.
Stefano, we're out of time. As you know, I always like to end these shows on a bright note. Given everything that's happening right now, we need more standards for the digital health passes, things like that. Give us an idea. We're at the middle of the year. Are you optimistic for the rest of the year? Is there a, quote, new normal out there that we should be looking for? What do you see happening that maybe gives you a little bit of hope?
Well, when we last talked, Matt, I mentioned the spaghetti western film, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I should mention now the the dead calm as a movie that we could quote to reflect the situation at the moment. So I think that the best is to be realistic, and realistically in the region I don't see huge revolutionary changes to happen in the coming months. But I also share with you a level of optimism because other regions are testing protocols, models that will prove to be successful if, again, these processes can be managed over a certain period of time. We are improving in terms of knowledge, of understanding, and again, there are some states, key aviation markets that are moving on. I cannot think some of the countries in this region to lose their competitive advantage in the medium-long terms. This is why I share with you a level of optimism.
Stefano Baronci, Director General of ACI Asia-Pacific. I can't talk today for some reason. Thanks for joining me in conversation.
Thank you very much, Matt.